It's a great pleasure to have you join us in this session of the Connext conference. It's a big privilege for us today to have our next speaker from the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa join us. It's always a privilege to have the regulator participate in these conversations. I find that sometimes there's so much of the private sector doing the talking, and it still remains incredibly important for us to give a voice also to the regulator, because they bring a different view of the sector, and it's important for us to understand their side of the coin. And today we're joined by the very infamous Dr. Charlie Lewis. Most of you already know him. He needs very, very little introduction, and he's a councillor with the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, or ICASA, as we refer to it. And Councillor Lewis has extensive experience across the field of the ICT sector in policy and regulation, and it's ranged from telecommunications and broadcasting to broadband and the internet. His knowledge and expertise covers an immense array of key areas, ranging from universal access and service through to the digital divide, consumer protection, quality of service statistics and indicators, to spectrum management, and of course, you know, the fourth industrial revolution, which is a much bigger term as we refer to it. His career has been very varied. He's been from a high school teacher in maths and English to an information system analyst, a head of department IT at COSATU, senior lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand, independent analyst and an independent analyst and researcher. And he's managed and taught professional development and academic courses on ICT policy and regulation to policymakers, regulators, and industry practitioners. Councillor Lewis holds a BA Honours in English, a higher education diploma, an MCOM in Management and Information System, and a PhD or Doctor of Philosophy. He's a published author. His book, Regulating Telecommunications in South Africa, Universal Access and Service, was published by Palgrave Press in 2000, following on from the research of his award-winning PhD thesis. He's recently served on the ministerial task team on post-COVID-19 economic response strategy, having previously been appointed to serve on South Africa's National ICT Policy Review Panel from 2012 to 2015. Councillor Lewis was formerly an academic. He's currently a regulator, and we're incredibly excited today to invite him to share some of his knowledge with us, to bring a more regulatory view to our conversation here. Councillor, please allow me to thank you for your time and welcome you to this event this year. We were really excited when we heard about your appointment as councillor to the regulator, and yeah, there's great expectations from you, from our sector at least. But thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Juanita, for that introduction. Thanks very much to Digital Council Africa for asking me to join you today. It's an honor and a pleasure. I'm delighted to be with you. You've already had a fairly long introduction to me, so let me not waste too much time. I'm going to, first of all, touch a little bit on the mandate, but those of you who are familiar with the environment in South Africa and with us as the independent regulator in South Africa will be familiar with our mandate. We regulate electronic communications, historically telecommunications, we regulate broadcasting, and we regulate the postal sector. We regulate in the public interest. We regulate in order to ensure services to businesses and consumers affordable and of high quality. You'll see our mandate derives all the way from the Constitution, but principally we established under the ICASA Act of 2000, and much of our regulation in the electronic communications space takes place in terms of the ECA from 2005. Our mandate derives from a whole range of policy documents, our policy mandate from the National Development Plan. We deal with white papers. It's a fairly extensive mandate, and we obviously respond from time to policy directions that come from the Minister, which we consider before we decide whether or not or how to implement them in terms of regulation. So much of our work relates to regulation covering the sector, issuing of licenses, planning and assignment of spectrum, etc. So I was asked to talk a little bit today about infrastructure in relation to the fifth generation of, sometimes referred to as IMT 2020, in the mobile space. And I thought it was just important or useful to start off with a couple of caveats and perhaps pose them as questions. Sometimes 5G has been described as a solution in search of a problem, an opportunity for vendors to sell user devices, in network equipment, etc., etc. So is 5G just a kind of a hype? Would be the first question we need to consider as we frame our discussion. Secondly, we need to look at, are there use cases, and use cases is the term that comes up so often in relation to 5G, that are context specific, where 5G, where you turn around the solution and the problem and you say, we have a problem and 5G provides the answer. So you have a use case deploying 5G technologies in order to address a particular issue, developmental, economic, business, whatever the case might be. And that would be a far better way of approaching the issue. Second concern is whether or not 5G is simply a way of providing advanced services to the affluent, residential communities in affluent suburbs such as Sandton, for example, affluent individuals or households. Is it only a technology that is in the service of advanced economic development in relation to the so-called fourth industrial revolution? And the flip side of that particular coin is the extent to whether or not 5G will address the digital divide in South Africa. Historical digital divide was initially a telephony digital divide from we inherited in 1996, but it remains stark, it remains persistent, and we need to look at ways of deploying, rolling out 5G that will not exacerbate that digital divide, that will develop use cases that are specific to our context and that will assist social, economic, and business development in the country. We need to remember, of course, and look at the kind of context we're in. For example, internet usage in households is approximately 63% of households have someone who uses the internet. But when it comes to internet at home, people actually using it on a device such as a laptop, the percentage is still frighteningly low. It's a mere 9%. And even in the mobile environment, we still have only approximately 63% of active subscribers who are in possession of smartphones. And that's not 5G enabled smartphones, that's smartphones. So there's a huge divide in our ability to access and bring the benefits of 5G to the country as a whole. Infrastructure deployment in relation to 5G is a key issue. Infrastructure is a critical bottleneck, or maybe a critical bottleneck for 5G, especially it's going to be in the case of millimeter wave deployments, high data throughputs, short range is going to require considerable densification of the antenna environment. And so the ability to deploy new infrastructure, base stations, receivers, transmitters, etc., is a critical bottleneck. And when you speak to the industry, you speak to people like the Digital Council Africa, they will tell you that way leave bottlenecks The lack of a proper framework for infrastructure deployments is a critical blockage and a critical issue that holds back the development of services. Deployment of infrastructure was provided for in legislation since 2005. It was in the very original act. We're now sitting nearly 20 years later, and it still hasn't been properly put into effect. There have been some attempts. There was a bill that was going to introduce a very substantial rapid deployment section into the act. It was dropped in a technicality. So there are a number of attempts that have been put in place, but we still, nearly 20 years on, don't have a proper set of rapid deployment guidelines. And they would be necessary, as the industry will tell you, to provide for an approval process that is a one-stop process, where you simply apply once and the entire process runs the way through. An integrated process where the pricing is standard, you don't get certain municipalities price gouging in order to maximize profit revenues from deployment, where the process is expedited, the turnaround times are reasonably quick, and which provides also for dispute resolution where this becomes an issue. We do know that a draft policy and a set of draft policy directions were issued by the previous minister in August 2020, and that the completion of rapid deployment guidelines policy direction was part of her performance agreement. We now have a new minister, and we're obviously eagerly and anxiously waiting to see the extent to which she will drive this particular set of issues. ICASA, as the regulator, is aware of these developments, and they are provided for in our annual performance plan, the one that's running up until end of March 22. There is a council committee that is looking at rapid deployments. I'm the deputy councillor on that committee. A second area, and it relates closely to rapid deployment, is the need to look at various forms of infrastructure sharing, from passive and active infrastructure sharing, to look at facilities leasing agreements, and strengthening that kind of framework does provide an opportunity to ensure that the rollout and the deployment of infrastructure for 5G and other services can take place in rural areas at minimal cost, because obviously if you're going to roll out these services into rural areas, low density areas, the cost goes up and the return on your investment as a service provider goes down. So infrastructure sharing and facilities leasing is likely to provide an increasing or play an increasing role in the deployment of infrastructure. I've just noted down a couple of forms of infrastructure sharing. I'm not a technical person, I'm not an engineer, so don't ask me to talk too much in detail about what they are, but they start from issues like MORAN, which is multi-operator radio access network sharing, essentially sharing the last leg of the infrastructure. MOCN, multi-operator core network sharing, which extends the sharing more actively back into the core network of the providers, often involving sharing of spectrum. And of course, Open RAN is one of the key issues in the key areas, which provides for interoperability on base stations and towers through open, interoperable, interconnectable hardware, software, with open interfaces between them. So those are some of the issues that underpin a rapid deployment. I'm not going to talk to this slide. It really repeats what I mentioned earlier with the addition of a nice little diagram courtesy of the GSMA, and gives you some idea of the differences between passive, you'll see on the left-hand side, and active, and you'll see that MORAN is less active than MOCN and less active than full sharing on the right-hand side. So the various degrees of infrastructure sharing which may be adopted agreed between service providers in order to facilitate and strengthen deployment. I'm going to talk also about spectrum, although it's not strictly physical infrastructure, but it is a key infrastructure component underpinning the rollout of 5G and similar technologies. So without access to suitable spectrum, 5G deployments are really stuck, stranded in the water. And there are three main bands of spectrum that people look at in relation to 5G. The low spectrum bands, typically your 700 and 800 megahertz bands, spectrum that is sub 1 gigahertz that has been used historically by broadcasters, has an advantage, particularly for fixed wireless access, long distance and rural deployments of 5G because of the propagation characteristics. It's accessible over far greater distances than the mid-range. And I've noted here one example, the 3.5 gigahertz band, which became such a controversial issue in the invitation to apply. It's a key sweet spot mid-range band that service providers are eager to get access to. It provides good deployment characteristics, good bandwidth characteristics, and is seen as one of the key 5G bands. We're not in the situation in South Africa yet where we are licensing millimeter wave spectrum, high bands above 6 gigahertz, which give increased capacity, faster turnaround times, but obviously are much shorter range and shorter distance. Just to note that as the regulator, ICASA, we don't assign technology specific spectrum. So a licensee doesn't get spectrum for 2G or 3G or 4G or 5G. We assign spectrum, although there are obviously, how should we say, qualifications and characteristics about how that spectrum is assigned. In some bands, there are primary, secondary, and opportunistic users. There are bands where, for example, the spectrum might be time division, duplex, or frequency division. Those kind of things are often in place, but we don't assign 5G spectrum per se. As I'm sure you're aware, there has been a fairly fraught and litigious high demand spectrum process, which resulted in litigation from several providers, an attempt on our side to negotiate an acceptable settlement agreement that would have allowed the auction to proceed. I think we came fairly close to finding each other, but sadly we weren't able to. And so that process has been withdrawn. The ITA has been withdrawn. Those of you watching the press will have seen a few days ago, we have just issued a notice, a plan and a program in order to restart the process and try and address some of the issues that service providers and licensees were unhappy with, and that will cater for 5G spectrum. Some of that high demand spectrum is key and of considerable interest to service providers in relation to spectrum, but it doesn't, of course, include millimeter wave spectrum. It's useful in this context to note that several service providers were able to launch 5G services on the back of spectrum which they had been assigned on a temporary basis under the COVID-19 pandemic emergency to address bandwidth shortages, capacity and coverage shortages, and several providers used that spectrum to launch 5G services, typically in affluent urban areas, although there have been moves to extend that more widely. In that context, I think it's worth noting that there are spectrum processes underway by ICASA, which will assist in securing spectrum for 5G. Out for consultation a couple of months back is a draft national radio frequency plan, which incorporates some of the decisions that were taken at the World Radio Conference in 2019, and that's out for comment. Public hearings have been held, and the process should be concluded relatively soon. A few days ago, we've embarked on the process to look at an IMT roadmap, and that would be of particular interest to those looking for IMT 2020 spectrum. That was issued at the end of September. It's a consultation to ascertain which of the potential bands for IMT 2020 and for other services are in use, are desirable, and to pick up some of the issues related to those bands. So that consultation is kicked off, and we hope to have that process concluded by early in the next year. It's important to note some of the issues in relation to spectrum. Some of these were picked up in the report which the authority did earlier this year, looking at 5G. The question of making sure there's sufficient contiguous spectrum, because with the high bandwidth requirements of 5G services, providers need substantial blocks of contiguous spectrum, adjacent spectrum. There are obviously debates as to how much is necessary. One can function with smaller blocks, but the bigger blocks tend to provide greater efficiencies. So in the mid-bands, people are interested or keen to secure as much as 80 to 100 megahertz. In the high bands, the millimeter wave bands, the requirement must be much larger. One of the issues that emerged from our report was recommendations from stakeholders for spectrum trading to be permitted. That would require a change to legislation, but it would assist, if it were permitted, for the deployment of spectrum in a much more fluid, dynamic, and a much speedier fashion. We also, as the regulator, need to look at the administrative incentive pricing formula that's used to charge service providers for spectrum and look at ways of reducing the cost. In particular, that relates to high band spectrum, millimeter wave spectrum, where people are likely to have very substantial contiguous blocks. And so some of the factors in that formula may need to be adjusted to make that spectrum more affordable for deployment. We're also, as the regulator, going to need to look at licensing models for 5G spectrum on campus deployments and for industry verticals. In some environments, the spectrum or the licensing works placed through existing service providers. So a mobile service provider would provide the services to the industry, the factory, the campus, whatever the case might be. In other environments, there are aggregators who provide those kind of services to a variety of campuses and industries. In other environments, the licenses go directly to the companies concerned. So there are a number of models, and as the regulator, we will need to look at those models going forward. I want to touch also fairly briefly on standards and equipment for 5G, because obviously the standards development is ongoing, evolving, and one needs to make sure that the equipment is properly type approved so that issues of interference, interoperability, etc., some of those problems do not occur or are minimized. As the regulator, we work together with a number of other entities in the environment, such as the South African Bureau of Standards, and with various industry players, looking at standards issues. And that involves recognition of existing standards, whether they come from the SABS itself or whether they are aligned to international standards. Not necessary to reinvent the wheel. So if ETSI is recognized as standard, it can rather more easily be adopted by the SABS and recognized as an acceptable standard for equipment to meet. We also need to keep track of standards where new versions are adopted from time to time and make sure that those are put in place, and to look forward to where new standards are coming out from bodies such as the ETSI, etc., 3GPP, etc., and look at ways of provisional recognition of standards that are under development. As the authority, we're currently in the process, you may or may not be aware of this, of reconstituting a committee. We're calling it the Standards Liaison Committee, which will link us up with industry, with service providers, and with entities such as the SA Bureau of Standards, to make sure that that whole process that I've referred to above is done, adopted, and works effectively and efficiently, and caters for the needs of all stakeholders. There is an official list of regulated standards, was recently updated in 2020, and will be updated in due course to incorporate some of the developments referred to above. We're also, as the authority, do type approval of equipment, network equipment, consumer devices, etc., etc. And that process is currently undergoing a revamp, which we believe will make it more suitable for 5G and the 5G environment. A conformity assessment framework was developed, consulted on, and put in place about a year and a bit ago, February 2020. We like to think it's forward-looking. We like to think it's in line with international best practice. And we are currently in the process of developing equipment authorization regulations. They went out for consultation in March of this year. We have recently held hearings on them, and the committee is busy looking very carefully at the submissions from stakeholders in order to develop a final set of regulations that will cover type approvals of equipment. Finally, let me briefly refer you to the 5G annual report that we as the authority put out in the end of the first quarter of this year. It was informed by a stakeholder survey and covers some of the issues I've talked about here today, but some additional ones. It also looks at use cases. It looks at the 5G forum, which I'll talk about again in a minute or two, and covers some more general policy and regulation issues. You can download it from the link there if you haven't read your copy or read it already. As the authority, we also support a stakeholder 5G forum, was established in 2017, and it works through a number of working groups that depend upon stakeholder involvement. There's a working group at looking at use cases for 5G. There's a working group that looks at research and development. There's a working group that deals with spectrum, another one that deals more broadly with policy and regulation, and a final working group that deals with standards. And we certainly do encourage industry players, stakeholders, to involve themselves in one or more of those working groups to contribute to the work of the 5G forum. And colleagues, with that, brings me to the end of my presentation this afternoon. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it useful, and I hope it's raised or introduced some of the issues that may be of value or of use to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. That really has been very informative. It's a lot more than what I was sort of hoping for and expecting. Yeah, there's a lot of excitement around some of the dates that have been announced by ICASA. I think just like one question for me, I think, which is, we know that there's now a date that has been announced for an ITA, and which is all really exciting. If there is one thing that can again derail this, what would it be? Is that what would you say this is the red flag that potentially could derail that?
Well, I guess if there were to be a new round of litigation that would derail it, what we're hoping to do is make sure the process is more consultative than we did it the first time around. We were under a very tight time pressures under COVID. And so we tried to streamline the process. I guess we're again streamlining the process, but as you'll see, it's out there. There will be a workshop held. There will be an opportunity for stakeholder consultation. On some of the areas, there are differences or different options floated in the document that was gazetted the other day. And we look forward to having stakeholders contribute and input into those. You know, really, as the regulator, it's our duty in relation to that to get the spectrum out into the market as soon as we possibly can. You can't please everybody because that's the nature of the environment. We have to, although we have to listen to everybody, we have to consider their issues. We know some of the issues that came up through the litigation. We are acutely aware of those going forward, and we will endeavor, make every effort to make sure that the updated, revised ITA, when it's reissued, caters for all of those things and puts in place a process that perhaps not all of the stakeholders will always agree with, but it's a workable process. We can run through it, we can get the spectrum auctioned, we can get it out into the marketplace and get sector players, industry players, providers to use it to deploy services to the country. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Well, yes, holding every single thumb, crossing fingers, crossing toes, that we can make progress, you know, and fully supporting this immense job that is ahead of you. You know, there's no underestimating just how critical this work is. I have to say, I'm really glad I'm not in your shoes at the moment. Because I think it's quite a job, but if we can get it right, and you know, and if the regulator can get it right, and yourself included in that team, we're making history, and that's certainly something to be proud of. And so,
thank you.
Good luck with this road ahead.
We're not perfect. We make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes, but we do make every effort to make sure that we do our work in the public interest.
Thank you, Councillor. All the best. We're rooting for you and for the regulator, and we really, you know, South Africa needs this, and we know that it's going to unlock an immense amount of opportunities for our country. So we're wishing you all the best in this phenomenal endeavour.